Hello and welcome to This Week in Global Development. I'm David Ainsworth, I'm the business editor here at Devex, and we have a special episode looking forward to UNGA, one of the biggest events of the year in development, and to give us a preview of what the key issues are. I'm joined by Colum Lynch, our senior global reporter, who is, as everybody knows, a specialist and expert in the United Nations, and by Allison Lombardo, is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State Department to international organizations and a resident fellow at the CSS. Let me come to you first. So there's a small number of key issues that we're looking at next week, really, which is the financial cuts of the UN, the challenges facing us over Gaza and a number of other key kind of security issues, and what the hell anybody's going to do about Donald Trump. So I wondered if you would kind of briefly give us a summary of kind of where we are on those three issues and kind of bring us up to speed.
Yeah, so thanks, David, and good to be here with you, Allison. So I was at a briefing earlier this week, and sort of an expert on the UN was asked the question about what are the key topics for the week. And he said that the three key topics are, Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, right? I mean, it's partly a joke, but it's like everybody is waiting to get clarity on where the United States is in terms of its relationship with the United Nations, with multilateral organizations more broadly. And it's not clear at this point. So there will be heads of state will be coming here to try and get some face time from Trump. They will be listening carefully to every word that he says during his address to the General Assembly. But apart from Trump, I mean, there really are a number of serious issues that people are grappling with this week. As you mentioned, at the top of the list for the UN is the question of the sort of massive U.S. financial cuts to the organization, both to the semi-autonomous humanitarian agencies like WFP, the World Food Program, the UNHCR, the Refugee Agency, and also we're now heading into budget negotiations over the UN Secretariat's regular budget and the peacekeeping budget. And so, the White House is sending a pretty clear message that in its 2026 budget that it wants to, cut out most funding to the UN. And for instance, things like peacekeeping, they want to cut all funding for UN peacekeeping. And the strange thing is that while they're taking this position, their diplomats in New York are actually supporting peacekeeping. I mean, a couple of months ago, the U.S. led negotiations on a mandate extending the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. The U.S. diplomats in New York have been, putting pressure on the Rwandans not to harass UN peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The U.S. is trying right now to get through a resolution that would create an anti-gang force for Haiti. That could cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So what do the Americans want? I mean, do they want a peacekeeping mission in Haiti, or do they not want to fund peacekeeping at all? So there's a big disconnect where that comes from. And then the UN, for its part, it's trying to, I think, anticipate some of the, the sort of budget cutting attitude in Washington. The UN Secretary General has kind of initiated a series of austerity measures, but also what's called the UN 80 initiative, a reform package that they kind of cobbled together earlier this year to try and, I think, signal to the Americans that they're serious about reforming. That process is now moving to the membership. There's no guarantee that the members will support a reform initiative from the Secretary General, or they will accept a whole series of proposed cuts that the Secretary General has issued, up to 15% of the regular budget. They would like to cut, and also something like 19% of the post. One thing to mention about the cut in post is that a lot of those posts that the UN would be cutting are vacant posts. So, these are posts that I think in the past the UN has not filled because of financial pressures. One other thing I'd mention, I mean, there's all this discussion about the reform and everything like that, but at the same time, the UN is facing, a $1.5 billion deficit from the U.S., which is built up over a refusal to pay the full cost that they're assessed for peacekeeping. And that is what has put pressure on the UN over the last couple of years to not fill these posts, to basically find ways to save money. So that's where we are. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out.
Allison, you've been closely watching the relationship between the United States and the United Nations. It looks like it's rather breaking down. Do you want to tell us where you think we're at the moment?
Yeah, I think as Colum said, we're in a bit of a confused state. So the right budget hand doesn't really know what the political hand is doing. And in February, the White House initiated a review of all the treaties and international institutions that the U.S. was a part of, and they haven't come out with the results of that review. And my suspicion is that when looking further into some of these bodies, they found that there's constituencies for them and a need for them. So, for example, one of the funding lines that did go through was for ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, because the United States wants planes flying to America and around the world safely and wants to participate in those rules of the road. So when you look closely at some of these bodies, you see that there are actual tangible U.S. interests in some of these global goods. And so while you have the budget zeroing out on regular membership dues, on peacekeeping, and on voluntary contributions, I do think you're going to see some discussion about what participation looks like. And then that conflict between not paying for things that you're participating in is going to be very serious. But I do think Colum's right that the budget cuts are significant, and the pain is starting right now. So with the rescissions package, which is very wonky kind of American budget process, including this pocket rescission that's going to happen most likely this month, the United States is only paying half of what it owes the UN for last year. So the pain is immediate. The FY26 budget, which is going to be next year's money, is still being negotiated in Congress. Quietly behind the scenes, you see a lot of work being done on the Senate side for those traditional kind of Republican hawks who have supported U.S. global leadership, wanting to put some money for the UN because they appreciate the kind of infrastructure it provides, with the more MAGA wing of the party in the House, which yesterday just rejected an amendment to add in the U.S. dues amount to the budget bill. So you really see this playing out in the Congress as well, and it's not quite clear it will land. But frankly, I'm not particularly optimistic, not only because of the political pressures in the United States, but because the administration, in the end, could rescind this money again next year if they're really serious about not paying at the UN. What Colum also mentioned is the kind of wraparound funding. So with the drastic and dramatic cuts of U.S. foreign assistance, the closure of U.S. aid, all of these supportive programs that maybe the money isn't going directly to the UN, but support the ecosystem around that. So money going to ICRC or IRC or some of the international NGOs was so dramatically cut back. So even if you see a few $100 million trickling out to WFP and other places, the ecosystem, the cluster system, all of the organizations will be dramatically reduced in funding, really putting pressure on the UN and to figure out what the new ecosystem looks like. And it's really not very clear. More just on the political side, I think it's worth noting, you see the United States pulling out of several institutions. Most of these so far are not unexpected. They happened during the first Trump administration. There was debates about them on the kind of ideological side in previous Republican administrations. But like the Human Rights Council, UNFPA, UNESCO, in fact, WHO, which I think is more problematic, but was not necessarily surprising. And you do see the Trump administration wanting to participate in some of the more technical bodies and security-focused bodies. So, like I mentioned, ICAO, the International Maritime Organization, got at least a nod in some of the work, which accounts for 90% of the world's shipping traffic. It's an important one to American business. You also saw money go to IAEA. I think OPCW will see some money on the nuclear side. So you see interest in the U.S. government, security architecture, and the economic side of the house saying, hey, we really need these institutions. You've also seen the U.S. fund the International Telecommunications Union and support the American candidate for the head of that body. That's interesting because really that's where the fight over AI and emerging tech is going to play out in many ways. Not only there, but certainly there. And they've endorsed a candidate that was endorsed by the Biden administration to lead that body. So I do think you will still see some participation, even though the drawback is really dramatic and I think more permanent than folks had anticipated.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that, from our perspective and from New York, it's hard to see where the decision making is happening on these issues. So we do not have a U.S. ambassador confirmed. Mike Waltz has been kind of waiting in the wings. There isn't going to be Foreign Service personnel at the senior levels. I mean, traditionally, the number 2 has always been a Foreign Service officer, the deputy ambassador. This time, it's the former spokeswoman of the State Department under Trump 2, and also someone who has had most of the past as an author, sort of very much engaged in the culture wars, and as a sort of a commentator for Fox News. So you don't have kind of traditional diplomatic figures in play, and that's going to be very interesting to see, where the center of decision making is going to play out, even when Waltz comes to New York. This sort of contrasts with the feeling that everybody had that Trump would be somewhat interested in the UN when he when he was reelected, because his first cabinet appointee was Lisa Stefanik, and she was going to be a cabinet member. She was going to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN. It was a signal that the U.S. would engage with the UN. And then she was kind of withdrew her nomination because she was needed to help in the House to pass the big, budget bill that Trump was trying to pursue. And then they just left it kind of dangling for months and months and months. Most of the policy, the day-to-day policy is sort of run out of the State Department, a young guy named McCoy Pitt. But generally, the big decisions it's not quite clear who's making them. And I'm not sure. We'll see what happens. Maybe Waltz will be confirmed at the last minute before next week's high-level meeting, or maybe they'll just send him as like a delegate, as a member of the U.S. delegation, and confirm him later. But everybody's kind of waiting for him to get here.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Colum, that it's really, I would say, transactional at best and ideological at worst. So the first Trump administration took more of a practical approach where they engaged. There were some hobby horses that they really beat up on. And, as Americans like to call for reform across administrations at the UN. But it was almost left comparatively alone. This time, I think you see more of the ideological battle waged at the UN. It's a platform for that. So going as far as to say that the Americans are objecting to the use of the word gender in different texts, not just focused on abortion issues or sexual reproductive health and rights, but really not using the word gender. And so pursuing this anti-DEI approach on the global stage is, I think, the main use that they see of the UN. And then I do think you will see some transactional approaches. There is a desire for a tool to use in need, and the UN may be that. There is a desire potentially to provide aid in Syria, WFP, at UNICEF, and others looking that. And so I think you'll see a lot of picking and choosing the approach, but I think the best we will get is a transactional approach, and that works is at Galash.
So one thing you were telling me about before we started with the different kind of pots of money that wasn't there yet. Obviously, there's money that was owed from previous years. There's peacekeeping funding, which has been building up for quite some time. There's the mandatory assessed contributions, which all countries need to pay, and then a large set of pieces of voluntary funding that the United States had previously committed to. Now, perhaps the most serious here is the mandatory assessment, I think. Are we hearing that the US will not pay the kind of mandatory assessed contributions that all people have to pay in order to be a member of the United Nations? Is that kind of on the cards?
Yeah. The current proposal from the executive branch here is to not pay membership dues. That's in the House bill right now. And like I said, there was an amendment rejected just yesterday by the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to add some of that money back in, and it was rejected. So that 22%, the assessment, currently is on track not to pay. Now, will that stand as it makes its way through if we actually get a budget this year in Washington? I don't know, but yes, that is correct. And I think the consequence of that is that it's a little bit of a complicated formula, but if you owe more than you have to pay over the course of 2 years, you lose your vote in the General Assembly. So that would probably be about 3 years from now, maybe 3 years from now, depending on exactly what mets out. And so that would be the consequence. Now, I don't necessarily believe that the administration would be particularly nervous about that, given their view of the UN. Given how some of the General Assembly votes go, the United States is not often or can be on the outside of the majority on many of these. And it does not touch the Security Council vote. So the real emphasis is going to be the Security Council. I will say that dues to other organizations, each UN organization has their own kind of wonky rule book and rules of procedure of when you get kicked out of the executive committee or the body. And so it varies across the board. And you may see them looking more closely at that for ones that they want to stay in, like ICAO, and ones maybe that they don't care about.
It seems like this is a kind of problematic situation for the United Nations. It probably didn't really have a structure in place for what to do if its largest member and most powerful member suddenly decided to completely disengage with every kind of aspect of it, or with most aspects of it. It's based in New York. The United States is a member of the Permanent Security Council, and it doesn't seem as if there's really any kind of thinking right now among the United Nations and its members about how to deal with this level of kind of disengagement from the United States. I don't know whether that's your perception as well, or whether you think that there's kind of some discussion taking place at the moment.
No, I think. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Allison. Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say that the pendulum does swing between Republican and Democratic administrations about the feeling of how much the Americans want to participate in multilateral institutions. But fundamentally, there had been a consensus about the liberal world order that we had built, whether we are focusing on reforming it and leaning in harder or not, and using it or not. But there hasn't been this kind of rejection before. And we frankly didn't see this kind of rejection in the first Trump administration. Colum.
Yeah. So, I would think that, there's also this question of, what happens to American influence at the UN if they sort of go down this road. There's been a lot of talk about China. To what degree is it, eager and willing to sort of fill the vacuum? And that's a complicated issue. I mean, the Chinese have stepped forward in the World Health Organization to step up funding as the Americans pulled out. But they haven't really kind of ramped up, voluntary funding for humanitarian operations. They haven't, made sort of bold steps within the UN, headquarters but they have been very actively, and particularly since the reelection of Trump, they have been making the case in New York that, look, our share of the UN budget is now approaching the Americans. They pay 20% of the regular budget. The Americans pay 22%. They pay over 23% peacekeeping. The Americans are assessed about 27%, but only pay 25%. So the Chinese are saying, look, if you want to do these, draw down staff, cut staff, make these changes, then, you need to sort of focus on nationals from the U.S. who are not paying their bills and who are in deep arrears. And you need to give us more jobs to reflect our rightful place in the organization. And according to the UN's own calculations, China is underrepresented at the UN. So is the U.S., strangely enough, even though it has a lot of people working at the UN, but it's considered on the basis of the size of its country and other calculations that it's underrepresented. So I think that China is making a much more active push for a broader role. There have been other developments. We cover very closely the Sevilla Conference on Financing for Development. I mean, they, reached an agreement without the United States. The pandemic agreement was reached. So stuff is happening. Legislation is moving through the UN system, and states are making decisions on their own without the United States there at the table. So, there are real questions about whether this sort of gradually erodes the American position. I mean, obviously, we're kind of the most powerful country in the world. We are not going to be isolated in that way, but, it's becoming clear that by not participating, we're ceding this ground to others.
There are two maybe own goals that I would highlight that kind of play this, particularly that benefit China. So the first would be the United States kind of unprompted rejection of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, whether you want to invest in them, whether you want to use that framework or not, I think coming out and saying we're against this, long agreed, very much a focus of developing countries, doesn't make a ton of sense politically, and certainly allows the Chinese to say, well, we're the captain of the G77 and we're really investing here, and you should be with us. And so that, I think, was just an unnecessary mistake. The second is the pullback from the human rights institutions and frameworks. Whether you like it or not, the United States is one of the only countries that challenges China in those fora, both the way that they can work on changing norms and language away from individual rights to collective rights, and their own human rights practices at home. Many other countries are just too risk averse to take them to the bat there. And so leaving that as open space, I think, is really unfortunate.
Yeah, you see them. I mean, you see the Chinese in these closed door meetings at the UN on development issues. And, China has traditionally negotiated alongside the Group of 77, which is this 130 plus kind of developing countries who operate as a bloc, somewhat divided bloc, but as a bloc at the UN. And so they keep driving, this point about how they're supporters of multilateralism, something that, countries in the developing world really, really depend and care about. And they're aligning themselves. And if you listen to their public statements, I mean, they sound like, they could be Norway or something like that. They seem like they really embrace all of these, issues of international cooperation. I mean, the way that they conduct themselves in reality is quite, different. They behave like a big power and they throw their weight around and that sort of stuff. But they really are kind of, in a way, increasingly sort of like identifying themselves with the broader membership. And, the UN in some ways it's a game of numbers and votes, particularly in the General Assembly. And this over time could really help the Chinese, project their influence. At the same time, though, the Chinese don't seem like they're keen to replace the Americans as the leader of the international system. That requires a lot of kind of, diplomatic software that maybe they're not comfortable, using. And maybe they don't want to have that responsibility and the risk of being, blamed when things go wrong. But they're clearly finding ways to sort of assert themselves a bit more aggressively. But one point, though, which runs counter to this narrative, is that because China has now assessed so much of a portion of the UN budget, when you get into these closed door budget negotiations, they sound a lot like the Americans, right? They want cuts in peacekeeping. They want, they're wondering, why does this stuff cost so much? How could we save money? And it's not just the traditional view they took in budget negotiations, which we don't want, we don't want like governance funding. We don't want gender, human rights funding. It's basically core security stuff that they don't want because it's expensive. And that's an area where the U.S. and China are probably going to come closer together than they are on a lot of other issues.
Okay. And obviously we're moving into the UNGA high level week where everybody's gathered in New York to kind of talk this stuff through. How do we see it moving forward over the next few days? What are they going to talk about? What might change? Are we going to see progress on any of the key issues that we're discussing here?
No. Well, the big thing is going to be Palestinian statehood, right? So the French and the Saudis have arranged, have sort of supported this process of General Assembly resolutions and meetings, sort of trying to reinforce the two-state solution. And this is becoming a vehicle for expanding the recognition of Palestine as a state. The concern is that The Israelis are moving towards possible annexation of the West Bank, the destruction of Gaza. And so the feeling is that a negotiation between the parties is not really going to happen. And so they're going to have unilateral recognition. So countries like France, the UK, Australia, Canada, a number of others have indicated that they're looking to recognize Palestine. So the U.S. has responded by denying a visa to President Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis have kind of warned that, kind of hinted that this may, trigger a decision by them to announce the annexation of the West Bank. Prime Minister Netanyahu will be here at the end of the week, and he always delivers a quite, combative address, and that's expected to happen this time again. So in terms of the whole question of Palestinian statehood, that is going to really come to a boil next week, and so people will be watching that. Ukraine will be on the schedule. It will be important, but there's a feeling that Trump's visit and Gaza are going to suck up a lot of the oxygen. There will be a meeting on Sudan, the kind of major international conflict that doesn't get as much attention, particularly in the West. That will come up. But again, Gaza, Palestine will really be kind of the dominant issues. And also, one can expect a whole series of speeches during the General Assembly debate, basically just making the case on the importance of saving the multilateral system. I think that a lot of people will be coming here and trying to figure out, kind of what's the future of international cooperation. And, are we kind of at a tipping point where the system is kind of breaking down? Is there a way to save it? And I think there were a lot of minds will be very, heavily focused on that issue.
And Allison, jump in if you want to kind of respond to any of that. But
yeah,
I have another question. You go right ahead. I'll ask my question.
I think that's right, that you won't see President Trump come with a grand vision for where the UN system is going and clarifying where they are on this. I think you're going to see, a listing of his Nobel Peace Prize worthy accomplishments, some America First language, and he enjoys being up there on the stage with the world leaders. And so you will see him comment on some of the kind of major situations he's been working in Gaza and Ukraine. But I don't think you'll see clarity coming up this week.
There's one thing that I'm really curious about. I want to be in the waiting room outside the General Assembly right before Trump delivers his speech, because for some strange historical reason, Brazil always speaks before the United States. And there's a huge feud going on right now between President Lula from Brazil and Trump over the conviction of Trump's good friend, former President Bolsonaro. And so there's a moment like basically Trump will be at the entry door of the waiting room as Lula comes out through the back door. So they'll both be in the room for a moment. It'll be really interesting to see if Trump turns around and if they exchange some pleasantries or they take a couple of swings at one another. But I would love to be hanging out there where mine happen.
Okay. I want to raise briefly a couple of issues that I think are important to Devex readers that I think are not going to get much oxygen here, and kind of just have a check-in on where we've got to with those. The funding of humanitarian aid is obviously a really key issue. That looks like it's taken a huge hit. Debt is an issue that a large number of kind of development people are really focused on at the moment. A lot of people are describing it to us as the single biggest development problem. And then decision-making reform is another thing that has really been put to us as something that these people think are really important. Now, my sense is that none of those issues are even going to make it onto the agenda this time round. Like a year ago, they were quite prominent, 2 or 3 of them, albeit we didn't make much progress. But I think we can presumably see here that we're not going to get anywhere on any of that. Is that your perception?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, a year ago, the focus was on negotiating the Pact of the Future, and there were a lot of ideas about reforming the international financial architecture, giving the United Nations membership a broader role, a broader say, and how issues on debt, on financing, all these other things played out. And, that seemed to be the basis of some sort of grand bargain between the West or the North and the South, particularly, kind of as the U.S. and the Europeans had difficult rallying support from the global South for the support for Ukraine in the war against Russia. And all that is pretty much, kind of coming apart at the seams. I mean, if you look at, we had an interview with Tom Fletcher, the humanitarian relief coordinator, earlier in the week, and he was saying that they anticipate that the humanitarian sector is going to shrink by about a third, and that he's basically going to be in every single meeting, meeting with heads of state, ministers, and others, trying to reverse this trajectory. But there's not a clear sense that that's going to happen. The Europeans are shifting a lot of their kind of ODA and foreign assistance funding to defense funding as questions about U.S. support against Russia comes into question. So that's looking pretty difficult, and not just because of the U.S. on debt. The U.S. was very much, and frankly, with a lot of support from other Europeans during earlier negotiations of the year on the, in the run up to the Financing for Development conference, on trying to limit any major requirements that would increase the prospects for debt relief or for giving the members of the global South more of the say in these issues, and on decision making for reform. Part of that would involve bringing decision making to the UN General Assembly, where you have a more democratic sort of collection of member states, rather than in the boards of the World Bank and the IMF and other development agencies. So that movement is likely going to be constrained by the new approach by the Trump administration. So in generally, I think that's that a lot of that stuff is kind of frozen.
That's a pretty dismal and depressing summary of where we are, but it does seem to be quite an accurate picture. All right. I think we're going to have to
just like what follow. The upside is the question that, I think the real question is the Trump administration is shifting to much more of an investment related business model. So, that's an area where interesting things could happen, and that's an area to look at. And on the humanitarian front, they kind of want to do humanitarian, work, but it's a lot of that is fraught. So, we look at Gaza, and the U.S. has helped with the Israelis stand up this private company, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to distribute food. They have a checkered record. The UN has refused to cooperate with them, as of other NGOs, because they feel that they don't align with humanitarian principles, and that they're helping to aid in a process of the forced movement of Palestinians, which is a violation of international humanitarian law. So so there is that. The State Department has talked about Jeremy Lewin, who is overseeing a lot of this for the State Department, has been in talks with a number of religious organizations. I imagine groups like Samaritan's Purse are going to be increasingly more active on this front, but nowhere along the line, nowhere near the scale of what we have now. This would be small time, bit by bit, support for, for humanitarian relief efforts. And then, the investment side of it, the private sector side of it, is going to be the area where they're going to invest most of their energy.
I would say the humanitarian picture is a little bit less clear because of the way that money moves through the U.S. government. It's need and demand based. So there is a bigger pot potentially available. Advocates have been fighting kind of tooth and nail to get every little drop out of that as they can for either specific emergencies or disease issues. And there are congressional constituencies around that, particularly for American farmers who are providing a lot of that food aid and now have been kind of left hanging with bags of cornmeal and other things that like should be going overseas. And so I don't think that discussion is down and out, but you still see WFP 90% down in U.S. contribution. 1 billion that should have been with or could have been with UNICEF this year is now not. So even if we see a little bit of reclaiming of that space in U.S. interest, you're not going to see the numbers that you've seen in the past.
No, and we saw that process was beginning even in 2023 under the previous US administration. We saw large cuts in funding to WFP and UNICEF and this sort of thing. There is overall more aid spending than we thought there might be, or at least there's a lot of confusion over how much aid spending is actually going to emerge from the US Congress. Very mixed signals there, very hard to read the rooms on exactly what's happening. The question that I think I find very curious, and I really don't think we have an answer to at all, is kind of at what stage do the other powers in the world kind of respond to this kind of US behavior? At some stage, surely you would say, if you're not going to pay your bills, if you're not going to fund the United Nations, you do not get this privileged access to it any longer. You don't get to have your cake and eat it effectively. But there don't seem to be any mechanisms for kind of causing that to happen. And certainly in Europe, at least, there's complete paralysis in European capitals because they're dealing with so many serious problems of their own. They just don't have the bandwidth to kind of completely renegotiate their relationship with the United States. And there's no unity over what they might want to see if they did try to have that renegotiation. So I'm not sure where it goes.
Yeah, I don't think anyone knows quite yet. I mean, we haven't talked about the tariff negotiations going on. So every country has some broad equities with the United States. And so playing hardball at the UN is probably not on anybody's top 5 asks right now. And you will see the Americans assert their both military power, political and economic power in different transactional ways. And so having an ideological fight isn't going to change minds in this administration and probably not worth folks' while. We'll see if, things come to a head, but I don't expect anybody to put this on the top of their list.
No,
yeah, I agree. I mean, basically, this shows the power of money and the degree to which the entire international system was propped up by American taxpayer funding, right? And so the Americans have kind of pulled out the rug on that, and there's a vacuum, but there's no one to fill it. And so the U.S. is still too important. And as Allison mentioned, all these countries have tariff negotiations they have to carry out with the U.S., and no one wants to jeopardize their position on that by saying anything critical at the U.S. I mean, look at the example of countries like, Brazil, who are, standing up to the Americans, and they're getting hit with massive tariffs. And so, I think there's a question as to, maybe this is the beginning, provides an opportunity for countries to become increasingly more reliant, an opportunity for for blocs like the BRICS to try and develop ways to insulate themselves from American financial pressure. But, we're not there yet. And the Americans still wield a lot of power, and their withdrawal has kind of left a vacuum, as I said, that, nobody is prepared to fill at the moment.
Right. And I could carry on talking about this, but I think we're already a little bit longer than we should be for this podcast. So apologies to our listeners that we talked about this for so long, but it's a very interesting subject. So I think we'll wrap it up there. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to you, Colum, and to you, Allison, for joining me today. And for anybody watching UNGA next week, please pay close attention to what we have on Devex. We've got a really full schedule of events and news. We'll have multiple newsletters tracking what's going on. We'll have a reporter's diary bringing you up to date with all the latest events. We'll be talking continually to the key figures. Watch this space. We'll have a huge amount of news from UNGA, and we hope you find it interesting. Thanks so much, everybody.